Lifting 800 million people out of poverty. New report looks at lessons from China's experience. So this is a relatively new World Bank report, and it was released a few days ago. But it's actually based on what China achieved last year. So finally, getting rid of extreme poverty within the country, and it's not an achievement that very many countries can claim to, lifting all their people out of extreme poverty. And I'll be looking into this article. We'll be going. This will probably be a long video. We'll be looking at it quite. We're going to be talking about a few things in here. I'll be elaborating a few interesting stuff. Over the past 40 years, the number of people in China with incomes below $1.90 per day, the international poverty line as defined by the World Bank, to track global extreme poverty has fallen by close to 800 million. With this, China has contributed close to 3/4 of the global reduction in the number of people living in extreme poverty. At China's current national poverty line, that number of poor fell by 770 million over the same period. So what does this sentence mean exactly? So just a thing to note is that $1.90 in the developed world is per day is nowhere near enough. I'd be lucky if I can find snacks at $1.90. But yeah, but where I live, which is Australia, is significantly more expensive to live in than in China. Even in the rural areas, it doesn't mean the country is richer or more developed. It's just how inflation stuff like that works. Our government could subsidize a lot of stuff, but they don't. All right, so getting back on point. So, according to the World Bank poverty line, and this is for extreme poverty, of course, China has lifted 800 million people out of the World Bank poverty line. So that's different from the Chinese poverty line, which is actually of a higher standard. Despite China being a far cheaper country to live in than most other countries, with the exception of some really poor developing countries. At China's current national poverty line, the number of poor fell by 770 million over the same period. So this sentence here alone basically disproves the often I guess it's common sentiment in the Anglo internet that China's poverty line is lower than the World Bank poverty line international. So the standards for poverty are lower, which is it's actually the opposite in reality. China's standards for poverty, what counts as poverty, are higher than the World Bank, as shown in this sentence here. So according to the Chinese poverty line, extreme poverty line, or national poverty line, it's about 770 million over the same period. So still an incredible feat even by Chinese standards. To take stock of this achievement, a joint study, 4 decades of poverty reduction in China, drivers insights for the world, and the way ahead was undertaken by China's Ministry of Finance, the Development Research Center. So I'll have the links to this article in the description, and you guys can check it out for yourself. The Development Research Center of the State Council and the World Bank, the China Center for International Knowledge and Development, blah, blah, blah. So important things here: considers the insights of China's experience for other developing countries and puts forward suggestions for China's own future policies. So what other country comes to mind? One that has a lot of extreme poverty and has a similar population to China? India. So the country most suited for this kind of approach is India. But I doubt our leaders would actually take that approach. China's battle against poverty has benefited the largest number of people in human history, said, I'm going to butcher this name, Minister Ma Jiantang, secretary of the party leadership group of the DRC. So let's actually look at what he says here. This is important. To sustain poverty reduction gains, China will focus more on achieving endogenous development in areas that have been lifted out of poverty and introduce vigorous measures to support rural revitalization. Our goal is to achieve common prosperity and high quality development, including through the rural revitalization strategy with the focus in 5 key areas: industry development, human capital, culture, ecological development, and local governance. So if you haven't seen it already, I recommend watching CGTN's documentaries on poverty reduction, and they're very it's very different from what other countries typically do, because it is, I haven't seen this elsewhere, but it's very like situational and contextual focused poverty reduction, and when they say poverty reduction gains, they really mean that. So we know that China is home to a variety of landscapes, and there's a lot of villages and stuff like that. I know these some really hard to reach places. So that's one of the primary reasons they're in poverty, is because it's so hard to reach the rest of civilization from, say, way up in the mountains or something like that. And so some road infrastructure connecting these areas. And for some people in poverty, it's kind of tricky, because it could be tradition or some other reason that prevents them from lifting themselves out of poverty. So as I said, it's very like highly focused and individual like family focused and stuff like that. So, and it's like the old saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day or whatever, but teach a man to fish and you fish him, you feed him for a lifetime, basically. So that's the kind of approach they are taking with their poverty reduction. So as I said before, CGTN has some excellent videos on that, and you should definitely check it out. China achieved its goal of poverty reduction in the new era as scheduled at the end of 2020. We have accomplished arduous task of eliminating extreme poverty and made significant contributions to global poverty reduction. Going forward, China will continue to sustain and expand the gains in poverty alleviation and comprehensively realize rural revitalization. The Ministry of Finance will ensure that sound fiscal policy measures will be made and implemented to support the transition. We stand ready to continue strengthening cooperation with the World Bank in relevant areas. All right. So they have completely eliminated extreme poverty, but not all poverty. They've done a really good job with that, but there is still some poor people left, and made significant contributions to global poverty reduction. So I said this in a comment of mine on Reddit sometime back, but it was in a post I made. But if you exclude China, if you exclude China's contributions to global poverty reduction, you will actually find that world poverty has actually been increasing. So the only reason we're seeing a dent in world poverty numbers is only because of China, and that's how massive, how massive their contribution to it is. Take China out, and you will actually see a increase in poverty, and this is forwarded by increases in poverty in India, which recently saw 200 million people fall back into poverty. Yeah, and this was because of COVID, but even prior to COVID, growth was slowing down, and of course, poverty reduction there is not as anywhere near as comprehensive as that of China, anywhere near as focused either. It's just, and of course, the you guys might not know this, but the poverty line in India is extremely low. Like it's far too low. Even though the country is really cheap, it's you just can't survive. It's impossible to survive on that number. And the current government has been lowering that number, so it looks like they're lifting people out of poverty, but they're not. And the next region is Africa. Of course, there's a few other areas in Asia as well, like Yemen, Afghanistan, these places in Asia, but their populations aren't that big enough to really put even if they were rapidly reducing poverty, wouldn't really put a dent in the global poverty numbers. The next, Africa as a continent as a whole. I'm not very familiar, but I wouldn't be surprised if the same things in India are going on there as well. So, generally, neoliberalism, which is what the vast majority of the world is on right now, is a terrible system for lifting people out of poverty. All right. So rural revitalization, what does that mean? It simply means to develop the rural areas, and in my opinion, bring them up to the comparable level of development to the cities in China. So tier 1 cities, up to that level of development. And I really agree with that policy. I do think cities, of course, they're highly productive areas, and but I think rural areas need to be equally developed. So if someone wants to live in the rural areas for whatever reason, they can live there. They can have a good job there, stuff like that. And as for the World Bank, I don't think there's much they could do considering their involvement with the rest of the world. China's poverty reduction story is a story of persistent growth through economic transformation. World Bank Vice President for East Asia and Pacific. As China's economy adjusts to a new low-carbon growth model, its social policies will need to be adapted to support greater labor mobility, upgrade skills levels in line with shifts in labor demand, and offer improved social protection to ensure a just transition. China's economy adjusting to a new low-carbon growth model, that's not set in stone. For now, that is the case. So, the primary reason why, so we know for a fact that China's economy can grow much faster than it is growing now, but the reason they slowed down the economy is because of the amount of carbon such a huge economy at such a scale produces when it's in a high growth stage, when it's going through really high growth. So once China completely transitions towards renewable energy, and in my opinion, nuclear needs to be the majority of the economy. It's just more stable and more reliable than renewable. But once that transition happens, we can finally see it's very possible for China to pursue once again rapid growth, because it's not coming at the expense of the environment. It's a highly sustainable, harmonious development with nature, and that's the kind of an ecological civilization. That's as Andre put it, that's the new direction they're going. So low growth it's not set in stone. Like I really don't like it when people say stuff like this, like as if it's set in stone. It's really not. It's better just to say for now China is pursuing a low carbon growth model, but this is subject to change in the future. All right, moving on. China's approach to poverty reduction has been based on two pillars, according to the report. The first was broad-based economic transformation to open new economic opportunities and raise average incomes. Once again, really watch the CGTN documentary on it. It's an excellent documentary on it. The second was the recognition that targeted support was needed to alleviate persistent poverty. So this is the focused, family-focused, individual-focused approach I just talked about earlier. They're going to village. They have a member. So they're going to that here. Support was initially provided to areas disadvantaged by geography and lack of opportunities, and later to individual households. So yeah, this is taken straight from the CGTN documentary. The report points to a number of lessons for other countries from China's experience, including the importance of a focus on education, an outward orientation, sustained public investments in infrastructure, and structural policies supportive of competition. Pretty self-explanatory, straightforward stuff there. Generally, with these approaches, education. China's education is of course high quality. Contrary to popular belief, if you look at the PISA rankings, China's cities, Shanghai, Beijing, all that, they're all up at the top in the world. So people think there's a huge divide between those cities, tier 1 and rural areas. But in reality, there was another study done which found that yes, there is a difference between rural and highly developed cities like that, but the difference isn't that much. So it's only slightly lower. So I would say it would be like Japan's ranking in the PISA ranking. The difference between Japan and those 4 cities that are ranked first. So it's not that much of a huge difference. It's still like big. Personally, I think it's a bit smaller than that gap even. So they would still, even in rural areas, they would still rank well within the top 4 in the world. And outward orientation, sustained public investments in infrastructure. Of course, a lot of countries, infrastructure is the backbone of any economy. So you can really measure the success of an economy by its infrastructure. And also the decay of an economy by its infrastructure. So like the United States, decaying infrastructure is a visible sign of the decaying society and economy. Sustained public investments. So a lot of countries in the developing world and the developed world, I guess, struggle with this a lot, actually. I think the few exceptions are probably Vietnam, North Korea, a few like Asian socialist economies, and a few state capitalist prior as well, Asian state capitalist economies. How China funds is through government created credit at the central bank, and it directs that credit towards infrastructure development. So it can easily build massive, really truly massive projects, to the whole country. And since a lot of developing countries are neoliberal, so they rely on private the private role in infrastructure development, and it's nowhere near big enough in scale, because private companies, of course, they want to they want to prioritize profit. It's nowhere near big enough in scale, and it takes a long time to develop. So I'm seeing a lot of like private in India, which really should be using this model for infrastructure, but we are not. And structural policy supportive of competition. So like that's e-market, all that. So farmers can easily access online markets and stuff, sell online, and you just need the infrastructure, give out the supplies. The report also highlights how the success of China's economic development is associated reduction of poverty benefited from effective governance, which helped coordinate multiple government agencies and elicit cooperation from non-government stakeholders. So it's not just a governmental approach in China, but it's an approach by the whole of society for this goal, which only makes things faster. To illustrate the role of broad-based economic transformation in poverty alleviation, separate sections of the report analyze growing agriculture productivity, incremental industrialization, managed urbanization, and rural-to-urban migration, and the role of infrastructure. The evolution of China's approach to poverty alleviation, from policy-based to countrywide social protection policies, and the targeted poverty alleviation strategy since 2012 are also reviewed. So when China first started this program officially, it was kind of similar to how other countries did it, but it evolved over time and into what we see today. The report considers the likely future structural shifts in China's growth model, including rebalancing towards consumption and high-value services and embarking on the transition towards carbon neutrality. I already made a video about carbon neutrality and regarding rebalancing towards consumptions and high-value services. This doesn't mean that China will stop becoming an investment-driven economy. It clearly won't. It'll just have consumption also as a high contribution to the economy. But high investment will always be primary, in my view at least. And the implications for China's future policy agenda. It highlights the need to close remaining gaps in quality education between rural and urban areas and to provide better social protection to migrant workers. The scope for improved integration of the various existing social security policies. So, over the past 2 years, the joint research team conducted field studies in the regions of Ningxia and Zhejiang, held a series of workshops with domestic and international experts, and worked closely with academic institutions on data analysis. Several working papers have been published containing blah blah blah. Okay, so that's pretty much it for that report. Really interesting stuff. And I think that is all for today. So if I see any other reports like this, I will make a video on it. And I'll see you guys next time.